This is the Practice of Therapy podcast with Gordon Brewer, helping you to navigate your private practice journey. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Practice of Therapy podcast. I'm so glad that you've joined me for this special edition of the podcast, or this special episode, rather. It's episode number 100. It's hard for me to believe that it's gotten this far. I knew it would. I'm just astounded by the growth that I've been able to experience with the podcast. You know, as of the release of this particular episode, we're approaching a total of nearly 50,000 downloads of the podcast so far, which I remember back when I started the podcast 2 years ago. I remember that first episode, and after a month, I'd only had probably less than 100 people had downloaded the podcast, but now we're averaging over 3,000 downloads per month, and it continues to grow. And so that at least affirms for me that hopefully I'm doing the right thing. And as I say pretty much every week, is that my hope is that this podcast is always helpful to you, and that you find the information interesting, and also, you know, beneficial to you in your practice and in your journey as a therapist, counselor, social worker, psychologist, or really anybody in these helping professions that we find ourselves in. And I'm so grateful to you, the listeners, for tuning in each week and subscribing to the podcast. I get all those positive vibes from people, and continue to get good feedback from people. So I'm going to keep doing it, and looking forward to the next 100 episodes and all that entails, and just seeing where this journey takes us with the podcast. It's a wonderful medium, and I've had so many conversations with different people just about how podcasting is really starting to explode, and it's really kind of the next big thing. And I'm so glad I'm here in on kind of the beginning part of it. I think the one thing I like about podcasting, and I listen to a lot of podcasts, is that it's just personal, and I hopefully in my sharing part of my life with you every week, hope that comes through, because I think it helps us connect and helps us feel connected to the world out there, and letting you know that you're not alone, and that we're all in this together. So anyway, don't want to get too teary-eyed here as I talk about that. But anyway, I'm so glad to bring you this special episode, and many thanks to TherapyNotes for sponsoring the podcast. And TherapyNotes is going to be our sponsor for the next year, and so they were gracious enough to reach out to me about doing that, and I'm happy to have them. They're who I use in my practice, and they are a top-notch electronic health record system. So be sure to thank them and check them out at TherapyNotes.com, and let them know you heard about them on the podcast. And if you use the coupon code Gordon when you go to therapynotes.com, you can get your first 2 months free. So be sure and check them out. You know, as I started putting this episode together, I started thinking about, you know, what sort of theme I wanted to have. And really, as I was reflecting back on the podcast and my journey just in private practice, you know, I've shared with folks before, those of you that have been listening to the podcast for a while have heard my story and know a little bit of my story. I started into private practice probably around 2005, 2006. I was working for an agency at the time, and was doing intensive in-home therapy with at-risk children and youth, and really kind of worked my way up the ranks within that organization, became a supervisor, and then later a clinical consultant within that organization, and really had gotten to a place where I knew that in the back of my mind, when I first made this move into this career, that what I really wanted to do was have my own practice and be in private practice. So I started my journey by really seeing clients very part-time. I just started seeing folks in the evenings and on weekends. I started my private practice really in the context of my church community, and I actually was seeing clients at the church. They had some extra space, and I'd use that space in the evenings and on weekends to see clients, and my practice kind of grew from there. And there was so much I learned along the way back in those days. I'm talking about it like it's 100 years ago, but really in the whole context of things, it's not that long ago. Back in 2005, 2006, there really wasn't that much information about going into private practice. And so I just scoured the internet and started learning about things. It was also about that time that I met my friend that you've heard here on the podcast a few times now, Dr. David Hall, and he and I struck up a friendship, and we were able to compare notes. And he was a big help to me in those early days of really just thinking about, how to get clients and all of that sort of thing. And so fast forwarding all of that, I grew my practice. I moved out on my own and got my own office space. I quickly realized that I was full and just was running out of the time to see clients. And so I brought on other clinicians and started a group practice, and it really grew from there. And then in 2017, I moved my office again and actually was fortunate enough to buy the building that I'm in now. And so I not only have a group practice, but I also own the building I'm in. So pretty huge move. And so again, like I've always said, I've learned a whole lot of stuff the hard way. But most importantly, when I started the podcast, that really helped my learning curve immensely, in that I not only drew from my own life experience in private practice, but also just learning from other people across the country and literally across the world about their practices and what they've done. And it's just been such a great journey. And I'm so grateful to all the guests that I've had on the podcast. But in this episode, I'll apologize, but then again, I'm not going to apologize. It's a little bit, it's going to be a longer episode as I'm recording kind of this intro. Don't know what the final number is going to be in terms of length, but what I've done is I've just pulled some clips from some of the various people that have stuck out in my mind as being people that when I interviewed them, some of the things they said just really resonated with me, but also people that I know that are have been there, and they have I've learned just so much from them, and they've certainly influenced me. So let's jump into these clips. And what I'm going to do in this particular episode is I'm just going to give a little intro and then play the clip for you and let you hear the interview that I did with my various guests. And I'll introduce those guests as they come up. When I think about the essential elements of private practice, at the very core of what we all do is just being able to do sound clinical work. And one of the things that is also true about doing sound clinical work is being able to connect with clients well. At the very core of being a great clinician, you have to be able to join with your clients. You have to be able to have some sort of connection with them so that they feel safe and that they are able to share their stories with us. And I think that's one thing that we don't talk about as much as the clinical side of things, but I think it goes without saying, you're not going to be successful in private practice if you're not doing sound clinical work that is, hopefully evidence-based practices and that is actually helping people. But anyway, my friend Jeff Guenther from the Practice Academy, and also you probably know Jeff from the directory that's out there called TherapyNotes, which is a wonderful directory that is really geared towards helping people in our society that might feel a little more marginalized, maybe people of color, people that are part of the LGBTQ community, all of those folks that maybe have trouble finding the right therapist. Therapy Den helps those people find the right therapist that is a good fit for them in their lives. And so Jeff Guenther and I had a conversation just about being genuine and about being able to connect with people in genuine ways and the implications that has on being able to market your practice. So here's my part of my conversation with Jeff Guenther. So how is so far? How has have these interviews changed your approach and the therapy sessions that you do, and also in just thinking about marketing and all of that? So what is? Yeah.
So for me personally, I think some of the things that like a lot of the clients that I ask them and that they're talking about in the podcast is like these ruptures that happen with a therapist, the ruptures in the relationship,
Mm-hmm.
And so in my own therapy, when I'm being a therapist, I'm a lot more conscious of that because, Jill, who you might have listened to, who you listened to, she said that like when the therapist that she was seeing pulled out the DSM and was like, let's see what we can diagnose you with, that was just like automatic turn off. And I don't think that therapist obviously meant to turn her off. She thought she was being helpful. Like, let's bring out this book of diagnoses and figure out what your label is or issue is. But Jill just ended therapy. Like she didn't really even give the therapist a chance to repair that rupture. And so, and there's another client, Jess, and then this other client on the podcast where they talk about how they went, they were seeing their therapist, and then in the middle of the, seeing their therapist, they found another, they developed a romantic relationship with somebody that they were seeing. And they felt so judged by the therapist. One of the clients like started to date a younger man, and she felt really judged by the therapist, thinking that was really wrong. Another one was Jess was saying that she decided to like open up her relationship and become like poly, and the therapist was really upset by that and trying to tell her like about all the issues about why that's not a good idea. And when I asked them like, oh, did you tell the therapist that like that hurt your feelings or you don't like what they said no. And it's just like, oh God, like I feel like sorry for them that they didn't speak up. I feel like empathy for the therapist because I'm sure that's happened, and that's why some of my sessions or clients have ended because of something that I did or said inadvertently, just because I was caring or I was protective of them, and then all of a sudden they just stopped seeing me. So that's really woken me up a bit.
Right. Jeff has a podcast called Say More About That. And what he does in the podcast is he's actually interviews clients or patients that have gone to therapy and have them talk about their experience with their therapist. And so a lot of wisdom from Jeff around knowing how to connect with clients and just how to do better clinical work, but also knowing how to market to clients. When I think about marketing, again, that's another essential element of being in private practice. We've got this idea, I think a myth sometimes that when we go into private practice, that somehow or another, if we build it, they will come, that whole field of dreams kind of way of thinking about things. But one of the questions I get just over and over again from people, and just a topic that is always a top topic, is marketing your practice. I think for a lot of us, when we think about marketing, it just somehow or another feels a little bit sleazy and just kind of like, I don't like doing that. I don't like having to put myself out there in that way just to get clients. But I had one of the first podcast episodes I did, and I need to get her back on the podcast, and that's the one and only Allison Puryear. And Allison has got one of the most successful Facebook groups out there, the Abundance Practice. Sorry if I'm messing the name up there, Allison. But anyway, I loved my conversation with Allison where she talks about marketing. And so here's part of my conversation with Allison Puryear. So in your working and you're coaching with other therapists and through your work with Abundance Practice Building, what are some of the common struggles that you see people that are going into private practice tend to have?
I think one of the most common is they're afraid to market / really uncomfortable with the idea of marketing. It sounds like something business people do, and my clients tend to really identify as clinicians, and they tend to see a great divide between what it is to be a business person who owns a private practice and what it is to be a clinician. And I see them as integral. Like, you need to have both parts of yourself present if you're going to have a successful private practice. Yes. And I think that telling them about it is marketing. And one way that I reframe it with people is that there is an ideal client out there for you, and you are their ideal therapist. And if they don't know you're out there, they may be suffering for longer than they need to. Right. So it's up to us as an act of service to take a big gulp and put ourselves out there, even though it's not always comfortable. But it's the only way our clients are going to find us, is if we're like, hey, I'm over here.
Yes.
So
yes.
I would say, yeah. How many tips? Can I give 50? No.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, I would say first, know that it's about showing up and continuing to try with building your practice. I think a lot of people are like, whoa, I'm 2 weeks in and I have no calls. And if somebody has a phone call their first 2 weeks of private practice, know that that's an anomaly and good for you. But for most people, it's a lot of trudging forward. And the trudging isn't forever. So I think keeping in mind, as long as you're working a plan, the whole, like you mentioned before, if you build it, they will come mindset doesn't work. It would be glorious if it did, but you have to tell people about it too. So work a marketing plan, know what's going to work for you, go forward. And I think having community, like, I think that we need people who get it.
Yes.
And our friends who are still in agencies might not get the new problems that arise when you're starting a private practice. So making sure you have other buddies in real life or virtually in something like a Facebook group that get it and can commiserate with you during the hard moments and really celebrate with you during those exciting, great moments, because they're the ones who really get the depth of what it feels like to book your first private pay client, or, you know, like, that's such an incredible feeling. And a lot of friends and family might be like, oh, good for you. And you're like, no, don't you understand? We need champagne. We need to dance.
Right. Absolutely. Well, needless to say, I guess you can see why Allison is one of my favorite people. She's just so energizing, so much fun to be around. And I always learn so much from her in listening to her podcast, Abundance Practice. And so I've got to get her back on the podcast. But, you know, the other thing, when I think about the kind of the progression of this and the essentials of private practice, you know, we think about marketing, and when we market, or, you know, in particular, you think about maybe paying for advertising or thinking about things that you do in your practice. One of the things that comes to mind for me first is this going to be a good return on my investment, a good ROI, as I like to call it. And so one of the people that taught me about this, or really got me thinking about this the most, was my good friend Joe Sanok, another kind of rock star in this whole private practice building space. Joe's got the #1 podcast for therapists that's out there. And as I'm recording this, I'm really looking forward to being with Joe out at his event, Killing It Camp, out in Estes Park, Colorado. And so I wanted you to hear from Joe and just his thoughts on return on an investment, and some of the things that he said. And when I interviewed him, I believe the first time on the podcast, but here's my friend Joe Sanok talking about return on investment, ROI.
Yeah, well, I think that, like anything, when someone's done something, it's easier for them to say, here's the quick way of doing it. I remember when I first launched my website, I couldn't figure out how to get an image in WordPress to be centered instead of being all the way to the left as the default. And it took my IT person 2 seconds to do it and to show me how. It's nice to have someone that can actually show you how. And it was that there was this little button that you pushed that made it so that you could see all your options. And I hadn't pushed that button to be able to see that I could center this image. And so going crazy figuring out how to do this. And so to have someone that's gone before you and done that, I think is a really important component of continuing to level up. And so for someone that just started a practice, it's going to start to grow, and then to reach out, whether that's to people in your community or taking people out to lunch locally, or getting to know people in a consulting capacity, or even just purchasing tools or automations, that's going to help you in a systematic way level up. And so kind of the bigger concept is we want to look at ROI, return on investment. And so at each level, your return on investment for your time is going to change. And so when you first start, like I said, you're going to have more time that you can put into things. But then over time, that's going to be harder and harder to justify why you should spend an hour working on anything. And so we want to be monitoring, well, how does that buy me more time? So if you hire a virtual assistant, for example, to answer your phones and to do your scheduling, that's something that I would say is one of the earliest investments someone should make in their practice, because it's almost always a multiplier. And what I mean by multiplier is that it's not an expense. And so if somebody, say you structure it out so that someone is answering the phones and they only get paid when they pick up the phone and they're scheduling. So 15 minutes here, 15 minutes there. And every month they spend, say, 10 hours on the phone. And you spend $15 an hour on them. And so you've got, $150, $200 or so that you spend on that person. For most counselors, that's going to be 1 or 2 counseling sessions. And so you've bought yourself 10 to 15 hours of somebody else being on the phone, and you in particular not being on the phone or getting trapped on the phone. And you've been able to do that by just working 1 or 2 hours. So you've multiplied 1 or 2 hours times 5. And so there's all those little things that are time multipliers and then money multipliers. I invested in my own coach back in March. It was Jamie Masters from The Eventual Millionaire. And she's $2,500 per month for me to do 2 phone calls with her, which you think about it and you're like, that is so expensive. I was with you, like, holy cow. But I can directly tie back the amount of money that I'm going to make off of her advice in 2017. So this is real money. Right now is at around $90,000. Wow. And so if you look at that, if I think I did 6 months of coaching, so 12 grand or so of coaching to then have made 90 grand. But then in 2018, I don't have to keep paying her. And so that's, the level I'm at. And, other people might be at the level that you're at where, even spending $700 a month in coaching or a mastermind group, that's a huge stretch. So maybe you're not there. So then you back up and keep saying, well, what is going to help me continue to grow and to learn so that I can have a coach be a multiplier, an investment in a virtual assistant, an investment in my website being better. We want to look at these expenses, not just as expenses, but as potential return on investment, where we're making more because we've invested in it, and that we see value in it beyond that money just being in our pocket.
Well, needless to say, I guess, whenever you hear Joe Sanok, you know that he's the real deal, and he's the guy that has really inspired me to do all that I'm doing here with the practice of therapy. He was the first podcast I started listening to, the practice of the practice. And as I mentioned before, he just really got me thinking about return on investment and really about how I'm spending my time and spending my money in my practice. And so, again, I'm so grateful to Joe Sanok and all that he's done to help me. He's been my mentor. He's been my coach in private practice. One of the other people that I've really enjoyed getting to know and again, I learned about Kasey Compton from Joe. I was listening to one of his podcasts and realized that Kasey was close by to me, I guess, in distance wise. She's up in Kentucky, but Kasey is one of these people that has just done phenomenal things in terms of growth in private practice. And as I think about the essentials of private practice, really Kasey's superpower and the reason that she has been able to grow a practice like she's been able to grow it. She's got multiple locations. She's got probably well over 100 employees now in this multi-location practice, Mindsight Behavioral Health. The reason she's been able to do that is because she was able to put the systems and processes in place. And Kasey was also the person that introduced me to this whole concept of profit first, and the author Mike Michalowicz. And so in this next little section of the podcast, I'm going to be let you hear a little bit from Kasey about putting systems and processes in place, and then also we'll move into hearing from Kasey a little bit talking about profit first and why it made such a big difference in her practice, but also let you get to hear from the one and only Mike Michalowicz and let him explain the concept behind profit first. So here's my conversation with Kasey Compton. I know as I've built my practice, I like to describe it as I've built the airplane as we fly it, and it's It's so. But for you, it sounds like you really put a lot of time and effort on the front end, just developing those systems. So, can you kind of walk us through that process of how you decided what systems to put in place, and like the onboarding process and all of that?
Yeah, that's kind of a loaded question, but
yeah.
Okay. So I came from a very, I'm just a very analytical person in general. So I think that helped me a little bit, and I'm kind of a process person in general. I want to know the steps of, how can we make this faster? How can we make this more efficient? How can we make this more effective? So I just have that anyway. But the couple of companies that I worked for prior to private practice taught me a lot, because not that they were really doing things the way I would do them, but they were doing things, and I saw different, just by working through their processes, I learned what I liked and what I didn't. And so I just already kind of knew how I wanted things to run and what kind of experience I wanted our clients to have. And so I did do a lot on the front end, but I think inevitably you have to build the airplane as you fly, because your practice is your practice, and what works for me is not, I couldn't just give to you and it just work for you.
Right.
It just doesn't work that way. Yeah, and I'll be honest with you, that is a lesson that I learned the hard way. I think I tend to be a little more high strung, and so when we started the group, my business partner at the time was like 10 times more high strung than I was. So without even realizing it, we were creating a culture that was very difficult to be a part of if you didn't have that personality. And it took about a year to realize that, and to know, like, hey, this isn't what we want. This is not how we want this to feel. And so I think it's funny, because now 3 years later, a lot of the people that we hired in year one that left and quit in year one have now come back to Mindsight as new employees, and they've both been like, what has changed? Like, it's so different.
Yeah.
And that's just like the best compliment ever, because the culture is key. And I think knowing what you want your culture to be, and then hiring people that match that, is really probably the best advice I could give someone. And it sounds so simple and silly, but it is so true. in the beginning, this business meant everything to me. And where I had been in private practice and I was really the only one responsible for my clients' care. And I knew I wasn't going to let them down. So I knew the quality, if I was providing the service, was going to be what I wanted it to be. Mm-hmm. So then when you start to scale and you start to have clinicians that are providing services, you just kind of start to have to relinquish that control and hope that they do well. And I think as we have grown, I have learned how to hire differently, and I have different standards and expectations of the people that I do hire, which has helped me to feel more confident in handing things over to them. And then also just getting rid of that negative thought that if I screw this up, I'm done. Or if I screw this up, it means the business falls apart, because we screw things up every day and the business does not fall apart. So I think now I just have a better sense of understanding that, yeah, we can mess something up and it's not that big of a deal. We'll just fix it and go on. So I would say that's probably the biggest mental shift for me.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have worked for companies in the past that no matter what I did to prove myself, it was never enough. Like nobody ever said, okay, go ahead and do that. Or if I had an idea, they would be like, no, that'll never work. So, no, that'll never work. So I wanted to have an environment that if someone had a strength or someone had a passion, let's get behind that and let's support them. And so that's, those are really the only two things that I've focused on. And I think the size of my company is just a result of that. It was never like I'm going to have 100 employees in 3 years. Just never thought about it that way.
Right. Yeah, one of the things about Kasey that I love is that she has such an analytical mind, and she can just look at stuff and just know how to organize things and how to put things in place so that it makes sense. And as I mentioned before, one of the things that I learned from Kasey way back when I listened to her on Joe Sanok's podcast, The Practice of the Practice, she talked about this book, Profit First. And as a result of that, I picked up the book. And when I interviewed Kasey, I wanted to get her to talk a little bit about that and the impact it made for her. And then as we this little bit that Kasey talks about it, I'm going to also make a segue into letting you hear from Mike Michalowicz. And Mike Michalowicz, I was just blown away when he agreed to come on the podcast. Mike is just a great guy. He's a #1 best-selling author, and he's got several books out. The best well-known, of course, the most well-known is Profit First. But I'm going to let Mike tell a little bit of his story and how he came up with the concept behind Profit First. But first, let's hear from Kasey and just her talking about Profit First and how that one particular system made just a huge difference in her practice. And the one thing I'll say real quickly about systems and processes, having a financial system in place is one of the most essential elements of private practice. And if you don't have your money right, if you don't have your business side right, you're going to have a struggle in making it. So you've got to know that part of it. So here's Kasey talking about Profit First, and then Mike Michalowicz talking about the whole concept behind Profit First and how he came up with that idea.
There was a point in 2017, we had some administrative issues in our group, and we had a few of our administrative team kind of go rogue on us and decide that, hey, this is pretty easy. I'll just go do my own thing. And I think that happens more than what I realized. But at that point, when I started realizing there was some cash flow, like I really didn't understand my cash flow as much as I should. I bought about 5 books, Profit First being one of them, and I took off to Gatlinburg, Tennessee, and rented a cabin for the weekend with my dog. And I read Profit First, and then that was actually the only book I ended up reading because I read it about 3 times.
Wow.
And it was like a light bulb went off. And I came home and I totally changed how, I totally changed my financial system. And I'm telling you what, I mean, the difference it has made in my company and just my sanity and not having to worry about, having one account that we have 100 things going in and out of every single day has just made so much difference. I can't even begin to.
Right.
Yeah. So I'll tell you a little bit about the premise first, because I think that's the juicy stuff that we need to know. I remember meeting with my accountant and him mandating effectively that I understood how to read an income statement, a balance sheet, a cash flow statement, tie those things in together. He told me to know my KPIs, which is the key performance indicators, my budget, this thing called the OCR, which is the operating cash ratio metric, which he implored upon me to understand. With all these things going on, what I did was whenever I was in the office or wherever I was traveling, I would hop on my phone or my computer, log into my bank, and I had a really simple system for managing my numbers. Instead of looking at all that stuff he told me to look at, I would just log in the bank account and follow a simple system. If I had money, I could spend it. And if I didn't, panic would ensue. So, and it would frustrate him because he said the worst thing to look at is your bank account because it does not reflect the state of your business. It's an understanding of these other documents. Well, what I've come to believe is that many entrepreneurs, perhaps even the majority of entrepreneurs, actually follow this similar system to me, this bank balance accounting. We trust our gut and our instinct. We're very good at serving our clients, at our profession, maybe selling our services. But when it comes to the monotony of the numbers, that for many of us is not our gift. So we revert to this very simple system. What I've come to believe now, instead of changing who we are, we should channel who we are. Meaning, if you log into your bank accounts and see how much money you have, let's have a system that sits there, and then let's channel that existing behavior to get the result we want. It's a simple behavioral technique. Maybe actually, I'm not too familiar with the therapy industry, but maybe it's a technique used is kind of redirecting an energy as opposed to trying to stop it. So what I did with Profit First is the first step is we literally take your profit first. As sales come in, revenue comes into your therapy business, you take a predetermined percentage of that money and allocate it to another account called profit. So instead of having that one account where all the money's going, we're now starting to sliver that money or cut the money up into different accounts. Profit being the most important than the first one. Also, there's another one called owner's pay. This is to reserve money for the owner themselves to pay yourself a reasonable salary. Then there's one for taxes because sure enough, April 15th rolls around and many of us get caught unexpectedly with no money and panic ensues. So the business is going to reserve that for us. And there can be other accounts too, but the one other account that's mandatory is operating expenses. And what you'll see is if say $1,000 comes in this week or whatever the number is, say $1,000 comes in. I used to think, I have $1,000 from my business. That's not true. 10% of that, $100, for example, may go to profit. 30% or 40%, let's say 40% may go to paying myself a salary. So that's $400. I've reserved for taxes, maybe another 10% there. So it's $100. So now 4 plus 1 plus 1 is 6. That means there's only $400 left to operate the business. We don't have $1,000 to run our business. We have $400 to run our business. I was an angel investor in a mix of companies. I was totally full of both ignorance and arrogance, which is like a deadly combination. And that failed miserably. I was on the verge of bankruptcy. I lost all my money. I had to restart. And that triggered subsequently this new understanding that profit does not come last. That's what we've always been told, by the way. Profit is it's sales minus expenses equals profit. That's how we run our businesses. And I believe that to be a total fallacy, because when profit comes last, we are saying it can wait. It's like saying my health comes last. Like that means my health isn't important. When your health is important, you say my health comes first. So that put this new notion in my mind. And now for 10 years, I've been living it. And the new book, the new version came out about a year and a half ago. I have it there strategically over my shoulder, well positioned for marketing purposes. But that in the last year and a half, over 100,000 companies that we're aware of now are doing the profit first method. If I don't have profitability, my business actually starts starving to death. We wilt away. The sad part, to your point, Kasey, the sad part is many people, when they don't have profitability, actually revert to pushing more sales. Like, we're not selling enough. We need to sell more, which, if we do the analogy, that's gasping for air when your body is starving for food. It's not going to solve the situation. So the process at this next level up is to start taking little chunks of nutrition, cash for your business. As money flows in, the simple solution is take a predetermined percentage, allocate it, hide it away from yourself, and run your business off the remainder. And when people hear that, by the way, they said, well, that's totally crazy because there's no money left right now. You're saying if I take it first, there'll be money left? It won't be. It's a shell game. And the thing is, it's not a shell game. It's a behavioral shift. There was a study documented by a guy named Parkinson. It's called Parkinson's Law. And it was really, his first essay was really more of a cynical essay about government and so forth. But the core point was this, that as a resource increases in its availability, the more we consume of it. And as it decreases in availability, wherever that resource is, we consume less of it and we become innovative and conservative in its consumption. For example, and I write about this in the book, toothpaste. Like, if you can understand just basically how toothpaste works, you'll understand how money works. Tonight, anyone listening in right now will experience this. When you go to bed to brush your teeth, if there is a full tube of toothpaste, we take out our toothbrush and we just put this long bead on there. It's like, we put this bead on, right? And I travel a lot. I'm actually, this afternoon, I'm heading out to Las Vegas. I'm always shocked when I visit a hotel. You just never know what to anticipate in the water pressure. Sometimes you turn the faucet on and like little dribbles come out. Other times, like in Vegas, often in the middle of a desert, you turn that water faucet on and it comes out with such force that the toothpaste like slingshots across the room. But I don't care because I have a new tube. So I put it on, which is the first part of Parkinson's Law. Full supply of toothpaste, we use it excessively. I mean, it's just toothpaste after all. If the scenario tonight for people listening in is that shriveled up, prune-like tube where there's nothing in there, it's unbelievable how our behavior changes. All of a sudden, we become this Herculean super being where we push and we grind as hard as we can. There's that vein you never knew you had on your forehead starts pulsing, and we extract the toothpaste, but now we use a little droplet of it. We find a way to get it out, and we use very little. And we will then brush our teeth with that. The point is, a full tube of toothpaste lasts for most people, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. An empty tube of toothpaste seems to last 3 or 4 weeks. So it's not the amount of toothpaste, it's how we use it. In business, the same way. When we allow all the money that comes into our business, we use all that money to run our business, we have a full tube of toothpaste. We use it excessively without even knowing because it's just a little bit of money after all. But when we intentionally constrain the amount of money available to run the business, we've taken our profit out and hide it away. Now it's the empty tube of toothpaste. We all of a sudden have these Herculean strengths. We become very innovative. We twist and turn, if you will, our business to extract more value of what we're doing. And that profit starts accumulating. The final point I want to make too is a mental shift. You won't become rich overnight, but a mental shift will happen almost immediately. When you see even that you've tucked away a small percentage of money, maybe there's $50 in that profit account, you'll start feeling this empowerment going, oh my gosh, I got $50 in profit? Wow. What if I keep doing this? And you see the money accumulating and it starts becoming very empowering to see profit accumulating on the side. And we inherently now operate our business more effectively.
Well, needless to say, I kind of geeked out on Profit First. And I will say this, when I read Profit First and really started getting my head around the concepts that Mike outlines, it really made a huge impact on me and my practice and just the whole financial side of private practice. In fact, it's what inspired me to put together the Money Matters in Private Practice course that I've got out there. And just in wanting people to know about this whole financial side, because it's not something that we learn about. And it, as I mentioned earlier, it is absolutely absolutely one of those essential elements in private practice that we need to know about. The other thing I wanted to just kind of segue into here for my next 3 clips, and then this will be it. I know, as I mentioned earlier, this is a little bit longer episode, but hopefully it's going to be worthwhile for you, and you can pause it and listen to it later. But anyway, have the next 3 people. One of the things that I think is important, and this is also ties into the financial side of private practice, is what sort of practice do you want to have, and what is the right size practice for you? And I think what it comes down to is really thinking about the lifestyle you want to live and the kind of practice you want to have. Another guest that I've had fairly recently, and he's again another person that has made a big impact on me. He's not a therapist, but he is another author, and his name is Paul Jarvis, and he is the author of the book called Company of One. And again, I was so thrilled when he agreed to be on the podcast, and had to wait a little bit to get to him. But when he came on, I think you'll understand just some of why he is appealing to me. Kasey is a wonderful person. She's built this multi-million-dollar practice, but that might not be the right size for everyone. And I think we've got to find what fits for us. And Kasey would tell you that too. Not everybody wants something that size. So I want you to hear again from Paul Jarvis, and the author of Company of One.
And this is kind of the point that I always come back to for myself, and when I'm talking to other people about it, is that I think that every business is a lifestyle business. And I think that a lot of times, especially on the internet, the term lifestyle business is this kind of bucket of the type of job that a lifestyle business is sitting on a beach with a laptop and being a digital nomad or something like that, mm-hmm. which I don't personally want to do that. I like traveling, but only a little bit. I wouldn't want to live out of a suitcase, even though I am a bit of a minimalist. But I think that every business gives you a lifestyle, right? Like if you're a corporate worker, your butt probably needs to be in a chair 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. That's typically how those kind of jobs work. If you work for like more of my industry, like a high growth Silicon Valley, like venture backed business, you're working probably 16 hours a day. Mm-hmm. That's not a lifestyle I want. So, I mean, I've always wanted a business that supports my life, not a life that exists basically to support my business, because I like doing things that aren't work. I like having a garden. I like going hiking. I like, if it's nice, I live in a rainforest. If it's sunny outside on a Wednesday afternoon and my wife is around, I want to go for a bike ride with her. Right. That's just the way that I kind of set up my life, and what I know that I like the most about it. And I definitely work hard at my work, but it's not like, it's probably 4 or 6 hours a day where I'm working hard, mm-hmm. getting stuff done. That feels like enough for me. It feels like I've made a dent in the things I have to do. And then I don't need to think about work. I don't want to think about work for the rest of the
I had a good friend that said, if it ain't fun, it just ain't worth doing. And I kind of, I say that tongue in cheek, but one of the things about being in private practice is that if you're not enjoying it, if you're not being fed by it, so to speak, I think it's time to take a look at that. But I think the most important thing about being in private practice, and I think the number one reason most any of us have gone into private practice is to support the lifestyle that we want to have. Another person I wanted you to hear from, and again, I was so grateful to get to know really kind of another rock star in this whole private practice consulting podcasting space, and it's the one and only Melvin Varghese from the Selling the Couch podcast. And if you've ever listened to Melvin, he is just a gentle soul, and he's just such a calming person to be around. But I want you to hear part of our conversation that we had about lifestyle, and just about the importance of finding the right size practice and doing what is meaningful to you, and doing the kind of work that is important for you to do in your practice. Hey, I'm going to put you on the spot a little here. What are some of the highlights for you over the last few years doing all of this?
Yeah. Well, definitely like just some of the insights that I've learned from. So, on the podcast, what I typically do is I do solo episodes where I kind of share what I've learned along the way. And then I interview clinicians that are successful private practitioners about how they're building their practices. And so just in the world of private practice building, I would say a couple of things. One is there's no like one size fits all when it comes to private practice, because ultimately you have to weigh what's happening in your like family life and your private life, and you have to figure out what private practice is going to look like, right? So for some people it may mean being on insurance panels. For others it may mean a solo private pay practice. For others it may mean a group practice. And so I think one thing I realized is, initially I was like, I need to do it this way, and I realized there's just people are doing all sorts of different ways, and it's okay
right,
to own where you are. So
right, that's I think that's so true, and that's what I've learned. You can get a lot of advice and a lot of direction from people. Oh, this is the way to do it, but I think you ultimately just have to find your own what fits for you. Absolutely, right.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's that what fits for you, that's what enables us to keep going, because the reality is the day-to-day of building a business, it's got its ups and downs, and so if all you're focused on is income, for example, it's not a long-term sustaining thing, because your emotion, at least for me, for a long time, I focused just on income, and all my emotions just went up and down, and it was completely related to income, And I think when I shifted that to a deeper purpose, that's when I think it shifted for me. So
right. Yeah, it's. I think I saw. I was snooping around on one of your websites earlier, and there was something you said there that really struck a chord with me. Is that direct? I'm going to misquote you, but you'll probably remember what it is. A lot of action and doing without purpose really leads to burnout. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that I'm constantly learning and figuring out for myself as well.
Yeah. I mean, and related to this, we were talking about this right before we got started, which is, if all you do is like focus on income generation, it's not like what you said, it's not sustainable, right? In the long term, you are inevitably going to burn out, or you just realize, especially I think for our field, especially many of us that are called into private practice, we have this deep calling to serve a population or a niche or a specialization in some kind of way, and and we all of us want to be doing this for a long time. So
right. One of the things I regret about doing the podcast is that I get to meet such wonderful people, and I regret not being able to hang out with them because we're so spread out all over the country and across the world. But I just love Melvin, and he and I are of the same mind and of the same heart, and he's one person that I've enjoyed getting to know maybe in just a small way, but in many ways we've really kind of immediately connected and hit it off just with our own way, just in being very like-minded in the way we think about practice and just about our philosophy of life and our approach to life. For this final little clip here, I wanted you to hear from my friend David Hall. As I mentioned earlier on in the podcast, David was one of those people that was influential to me in helping me get started in private practice. And in many ways, he and I have really rekindled, kind of not rekindled, but just really spent more time with each other and being able to collaborate on some things, David started a consulting and private practice resource business himself. It's called Psych Maven. And David and I, in this last, in one of the episodes he was with me, I can't remember which one this clip is from, but just wanted to really kind of reiterate the importance of finding supports from others in private practice, which again is one of those essential elements. Private practice can be lonely sometimes. And one of the things that I think is important, and I tell this to my clients as well, is to be able to draw on supports and really finding proximity, using the gift of proximity, being able to, find those people that are like-minded, that can nurture you, that can support you in your journey. So I want you to hear from David and just his thoughts on proximity and finding support.
In the diversification, what I encourage anybody is to find something that feels exciting and natural to you. That what's great is that there isn't just one way to diversify your income. And what I love about the different guests you have on here, Gordon, is something I tell supervisees all the time in becoming a fuller professional, whether that's in a clinical way or a business way, is that you can be a mediocre version of somebody else or a great version of you. And I see a lot of people who try to emulate somebody else, but in a way that isn't very organic to themselves. And so to find the things that you really like doing, and there's a lot of different ways to do it. And that's actually a lot of the coursework we are going to be putting out more on Psych Maven, as well as continuing education stuff, is thinking through alternative sources of income. And so, yeah.
One of the things I think, and this is something I've learned from David just vicariously, is the importance of putting yourself in proximity of people that are successful and people that are doing whatever it is they're doing well. It's either finding the right mentor to help you through that process, or being able to shadow somebody and watch others doing their craft, whatever it might be. But anyway, I don't know, David, anything you want to say about that? Because I know
I would absolutely agree. And it's not and I think an important thing too is it's not just a one way. It's not just about you learning from other people. It's also to consider how you can help other people. And I feel that in my relationship with Gordon is, Gordon's got me listening to podcasts I hadn't heard of before. When Gordon started podcasting, I was asking, well, who should I listen to? And he goes, check out The Practice of the Practice with Joe Sanok and Smart Passive Income with Pat Flynn, which are regular ones I listen to now. I was just telling Gordon last week about Side Hustle Academy with Chris Gildo, which is one I like. And, getting other people in proximity that are in the profession, but also people outside of it who, there's so many great ideas that can apply to people who work in mental health that are just it's just kind of in the ether in other worlds, that because generally we're a fairly conservative group of people. Like we're not inclined to think outside the box as a profession, and which is unfortunate because there's so many nice things outside of the box. Right. But as you have these relationships, there really can be a great synergy that goes back and forth. And, other people that when I started Psych Maven, it was putting together courses and other resources, but from the very beginning, I didn't want it to be just me. I wanted to pull in other people that I found really interesting. So,
well, I'm glad you got to hear from David again. As you can tell, David is one of those people that is just really motivational and just really knows his stuff. And I love the fact that David, again, is one of those people that he and I tend to think a lot. And he is another one of those people that just energizes me. And I really feed off of his energy. And he helps me helps me stay motivated. And also he's the person that I go to, that I bounce ideas off with. I know David and I probably talk at least every other week, and we'll spend, at least 30 minutes on the phone talking about ideas and talking about our practices and next things coming up and that sort of thing. And that's so, so important to find those people, in your life, in your practice, that can support you in the whole business side of things, but also just be a support to you in this work. Because as you've heard from me before, this whole private practice and clinical work that we do is such noble work, and it can be draining. And so it's important to find those supports. Well, folks, I'm glad you joined me for this special episode, the 100th episode of the Practice of Therapy podcast. I was, and I appreciate you going on this little bit longer episode and having a look back and just learning, thinking about all these different kind of essential elements, at least some of the essential elements as I see it for private practice, and being able to think about marketing and being able to be financially prepared and just connecting in genuine ways with people around us and colleagues and getting those supports, and also finding the right size practice, right size of your practice, and feeling good about that, and the systems and processes and all those things. I want to give a special shout out here at the end of the podcast here to a special person that is behind the scenes for the podcast, and that's my virtual assistant, Rachel DeHaven. We just recently celebrated the fact that she celebrated via text the fact that she's been doing this with me for a year now, and I couldn't do it without her. So Rachel, I know you're listening to this because you're doing the show notes and stuff, but special thanks to you for being with me on this journey. I'm so glad you're part of this journey and part of my life in this small way. One quick thing before I close is, and I almost forgot to mention it, is I do have another webinar coming up with my friend Julie Harris, and it's going to be on business entities. We're going to do a free webinar on October the 15th, and it's going to be at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And if you'll go to practiceoftherapy.com, and you'll see a banner at the top of the page there for you to register for the webinar. It's going to be a live webinar, and there's going to be lots of room for question and answers. And so if you've ever been curious about forming an LLC, or want to know why you should do that, or maybe even confused about it after you did it, we're going to be answering all those questions. Just some of the legal implications and the tax implications around forming a legal entity, a business entity like an LLC. So join us for that. Again, if you'll go to practiceoftherapy.com and just look at the top there, there's a banner and you can register for that. Again, special thanks to our sponsor for the podcast, TherapyNotes, and you can find out more about TherapyNotes at TherapyNotes.com. They are the premier electronic health record system for therapists. That's all they do is work with therapists, and they will help you with everything from scheduling and appointments, and it's just a wonderful system. It's what I use in my practice, and I can't live without it in my practice. It's what keeps us running. So go check them out. And if you'll use the coupon code Gordon, just GORDON, you can get your first 2 months free by using that coupon code when you register. So check them out. Again, folks, thanks for joining me for this special episode. Do take time to subscribe to the podcast, and look forward to being with you in the next 100 episodes or more. So take care, folks. Have a great rest of your week or weekend whenever you might be listening to this. Been listening to the Practice of Therapy podcast with Gordon Brewer. Please visit us at practiceoftherapy.com for more information, resources, and tools to help you in starting, building, and growing your private practice. And if you haven't done so already, please sign up to receive the free private practice startup guide at thepracticeoftherapy.com. The information in this podcast is intended to be accurate and authoritative concerning the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the hosts, guests, or producers are rendering legal, accounting, or clinical advice. If you need a professional, you should find the right person for that.